Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid conversations for clinical research sites. I'm Brad Hightower, and today on the show, we have Lorraine Dishman. Lorraine's worked throughout her career across a variety of different positions, from clinical research coordinator to clinical research project manager. She's worked in a number of different environments, including 3 different research universities, our local Department of Health and Human Services, as well as a third-party clinical research site. We had a great conversation. We talked a lot about creating relationships within clinics, academic versus independent research sites, and the importance of using this downtime to improve your skills and knowledge. Without further ado, here's Lorraine Dishman. All right, thank you so much, Lorraine, for coming on the show today. How are you holding up with the COVID-19 world?
Pretty good. Just hanging out, focusing on developing some professional skills, spending time with family, and just making the best of the situation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's seems like it's certainly affected a lot of us in different ways. Were you able to stay in clinic? Were you furloughed? What was your kind of outcome of the situation so far?
I was laid off pretty early on, so right about second, third week of March. The trials we were working on were pulmonary related for COPD, so we were a very high risk patient population. So they cut enrollment. We didn't have anybody active on the trial, so furloughed, laid off, however you want to call it. So right now I've been home for months.
Yeah, I mean that makes it really tough depending on what therapeutic area you're in. We work a lot with IBD patients, so they've got a little built-in risk as well. We were able to still see patients, but we couldn't do colonoscopies in the hospital. Our hospital was seeing these COVID patients. Things are slowly now starting to pick back up here in Oklahoma, I believe. Are you in San Antonio? Is that right?
Yeah, San Antonio. Our city shut down pretty quickly. We were very aggressive long before our state did. So I think we followed that trend, and then the state followed the trend, and then the other cities. So we're opening back up, but our mayor doesn't agree with our governor. So we're still under unofficial lockdown, even though our state's open, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I imagine there's quite a bit of that going on around the country, and it's affecting sites in different ways. But even then, no 2 sites in the same area. I've got groups here down the street from me who are all furloughed while we were able to stay open and see patients. So it's a real hit and miss out there. And I'm curious to see how the next, month or so progresses, or if things get worse, or things get better. It's just so much uncertainty right now. Yeah,
I'm wondering if sponsors that, put a halt to these studies that had maybe very few enrolled at the beginning will just decide not to move forward with that trial, just depending on, now when we renegotiate budgets and stuff moving forward. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah, well, and we saw some studies that weren't really doing very well. I feel like they sort of used this opportunity to just go ahead and shut their studies down and pull the plug on them, because they weren't doing that well to begin with, and then they weren't able to enroll anyone at all. But we're still waiting on some studies that had not started yet that we should hopefully be getting into the study startup process anytime. But again, it's crazy. Some are being super aggressive. Some are you get no word from. I guess that's par for the course in what we do. All right, so I'm curious to hear a little bit. I looked through your experience. It looks like you've kind of spanned the spectrum in clinical research. You kind of worked a few different places across a few different job titles. So I'm just curious to know a little bit about how you first got into clinical research. That's always a particular interest of mine. I feel like a lot of people sort of fall into the industry. So tell me a little bit about how you got your start.
I fell into it just like how you were saying. I was an undergrad, and I took a couple of elective courses that were research assistant courses in the social psychology department. I fell in love with being a research assistant, just being an errand person for all the graduate students. I just loved the process. And when I went off to graduate school, I started applying for research jobs. Walked in, had a fantastic interview. The lady and I clicked. She's like, "You may have this job," before I walked out, and I've never looked back. It was really random and almost meant to be. So yeah, I love it. I love what I do. I actually miss what I do. So
that's what I tell people all the time. Like I love working in clinical trials, because really there's no end to the different, aspects of what you can do. If you like science and research design, then Obviously, there's immediate attraction there. If you like, relationship building, interpersonal communications, you get to talk to patients and deal with people. If you like clinic work, you can, work in the clinic. You can take blood. You can take vital signs. You can do that sort of thing. There's a business aspect, obviously. There's a lot of tech involved. There's administrative work. There's almost an endless amount of things you can do within clinical research. So that's what immediately appealed to me.
I agree. I think there's a lot of flexibility. I think the flip side to that is when you have the basic fundamentals down of being a coordinator, there are so many different therapeutic areas you can work in. And I liked that too. You can do neurology, cardiology. If someone can see past that experience and say, okay, here's a certified coordinator. Here's what this person's doing. So there, it also gives you that flexibility for a different variety in your career.
Yeah, and that's an awesome point. I feel like once you have the fundamentals down, you can take those with you to any therapeutic area. So I went from neurology to cardiology. And I know that the people I interviewed with, they had concerns that I didn't know cardiology, but you pick that stuff up as you go. As long as you know the fundamentals that are involved in clinical research, it doesn't change. GCP is GCP. The consent process is the consent process. We're not, treating patients, so we're not necessarily always experts on mechanisms of action of these drugs. And you don't have to be. You can sort of span the spectrum there between relying on your physician, or another great thing is it gives you the opportunity to become an expert. The info's there. You can read the 200-page protocol. You can go read all of the previous work that's been done in the field, and gives you an opportunity to learn as deeply as you want about medicine and the mechanism of action of these medications and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think that's an underrated point. And I think that maybe sometimes people get too hung up on the therapeutic area experience versus the clinical research experience.
Yes. And then as I had an experience, I came from neurology as well. So we were doing stroke, epilepsy studies. And as a coordinator in that particular position, I was really lacking the understanding of the regulatory process and the IRB process because we had a research manager at that time. And there was an opportunity within the university to work in compliance. And so I wanted to learn it from that perspective. And I applied for that job, and I ended up taking that job for a year just to understand it, to make me a better coordinator and, research manager to progress in my career moving forward. So that flexibility is very important.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's something that, I've already stressed. I know other people stress is the more you can learn about the whole cycle, the better off you're going to be, the more well-rounded you're going to be, the better understanding you're going to have of the processes. And I know, especially, I'm guessing that was maybe in a larger institution you had worked in.
Yeah.
As academic centers tend to be so siloed. In my past, I never even saw a finalized budget as a coordinator. So I had no idea sometimes what we were being paid for these study visits. It was handled by somebody else who didn't know about clinical research. As a result, there's surely money left on the table. There's a separate regulatory group there who, you don't know, you don't know what's involved in an IRB submission. It's really contradictory to giving your people the resources they need to be better research coordinators.
I agree. I felt that way. And it can be frustrating when you're in those larger academic research centers.
Sure. And, I think it creates a little bit of a dichotomy, because I think if you work with a company where everybody does know their stuff, it can make sense to have different specialized groups, but not if they don't communicate. And I guess that's the key, is for them being really on the same page with each other. So, what we do now is we have centralized regulatory and centralized budgets and contracts, but those are conversations that are had and processes that are done with the coordinators involved. So at least everybody knows, what's going on. So if there's something in a budget that needs to be invoiced as it occurs, well, you want the coordinator to know that. You need them to know that. If your budget person's not communicating to your coordinator, then that may never be captured.
Right. That is a good point. True.
So yeah, that's what always kind of interests me again about the different setups in some of these places. And, not surprisingly, the more of the small independent research groups tend to have a better understanding of that. So I would guess that it looks like you've worked obviously in some more independent places. They were probably a little more transparent and less siloed than your larger academic institutions.
Yes, and that's why I left the academic institution I was at to take a job with a smaller research site because I wanted that more holistic perspective and that hands on. And then I felt like, it was a small mom and pop organization. There were four of us working together and it was all hands on deck. If something needed to be done, it wasn't because, oh, you're a coordinator, you can't touch the budget. No,
Right.
you can help. It's slow. We had a no-show patient today. I need your help, working on this feasibility, et cetera. So I really valued that experience. And so there is a stark contrast.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that just like that, I mean, I've worked in places where it's almost taboo for the coordinator to know what the budget is.
Oh, yes, it was.
Why, though? But why?
Well, I was told that we weren't allowed to know what our PIs had in their research fund for the academic department because one doctor might be more upset that somebody had more money in their fund, which
Right.
do they have time to really be upset by that? I don't know. I just think that face value.
Probably not. And if anything, that's a indication of who's doing more work or who's being more successful in their trials, and that's not you shouldn't necessarily have to hide that information.
Right, I agree. And the other difference that for me from coming from a large academic site to a smaller research site was just the enthusiasm of the PIs. I feel like when I was out in the real world is what I call it and working with private physician groups, those doctors wanted to be there. They were interested in research. It was, a part of their clinic. Whereas when I was at a larger academic institution, some of the doctors I was assigned to work with didn't really want to do research, but it was part of their faculty.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect point. So again, I had the same experience. So, and that's the reason that I left, a couple of years ago to do my own thing. It was, so these guys were not incentivized in any way. They didn't even make any additional revenue from it. It was sort of just expected of them to participate in trials. So as a result, unless it was just something that they were super interested in, they weren't interested in doing trials. So it became the burden of the coordinator because, if you're going to have a research department or if you're a research company, you got to keep the doors open. You got to keep the lights on. So you can't just sit and wait for the perfect study every time. So I found the same thing. Once I left these first academia and then a hospital setting, the physicians you work with are way more motivated. It gives them and their practice a higher level of credibility that they're offering research to their patients, and it's a good revenue stream for them as well. I mean, it's a win-win for everyone and for their patients.
Right. We've had plenty of patients that are interested in participating in research just because they love the doctor and they believe in what the doctor, is doing, and they have a lot of respect because they have that long-term relationship.
Yes. Again, a super underrated point that if your doctor is engaged and supportive, then you're going to be exponentially more successful enrolling these trials and helping patients who need help. And that's, really that's what it's about at the end of the day. So I'm glad to see more people are, recognizing that and sort of breaking free from the, constraints of these large institutions who've made it, a bureaucratic process rather than helping people.
Oh, there are so many layers. So many layers.
It is. It's insane.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your last position here then at Element Research Group.
Mm-hmm. I worked.
So that's an independent group. Do you guys have a standalone site, or are you? Was it more of an integrated network?
It was an integrated network. We had 4 physicians doing 4 different trials. So we were working on podiatry, pulmonary, and then we had a family physician working on a device trial for diabetes. And we had a phase 4 trials, phase 3 trials. So it was a nice mix of everything. So we didn't have an office per se. We roamed around per offices depending on patient visits and what needed to get done. Again, so I like that flexibility.
Yep, and I think that's awesome. I say we do the same exact thing. So we, negotiate a small amount of space within these physician offices. It's a great way to keep your overhead down, or non-existent really, if you can swing the space, and also puts you there with the physician. I think that's also a super important point that standalone research sites, I understand, and obviously they're successful, but the closer you can be to the action, again, the better off more likely you're going to be to get patients in the studies.
Right, because being in a separate building with all the coordinators on a certain part of campus, and yet you have your docs at the hospital, your docs in clinic, it's really hard to develop that relationship unless you're a high-rolling PI because you're really, really motivated.
Yeah, no, my last job, we were about a quarter of a mile away, connected through a tunnel with the hospital.
Yep.
We may as well not have existed.
Yes.
Unless you're standing in front of their face, there's zero chance they're going to pick up the phone and refer a patient to you.
Right. So being in there every day, and I think part of it, it's not just the PI in my experience at Element, even though my experience was short-lived because of, COVID-19, it's also about integrating yourself in with that office staff, that nurse, the, respiratory therapist that was there, the nursing aides, because they all also keep an eye out for patients like, oh, hey, I saw somebody today. Do you want to run up and talk to them? Because the PI might be busy, PI might not be there. So it's a holistic perspective of, we're all in this together. And I really appreciated that perspective.
Yeah. And that's almost sometimes more useful than the relationship with the physician. I mean, not more useful, but you're able to get more buy-in and referrals from office staff. That's, again, another amazing point. And I think a lot of that goes back to when you're in the clinic. So like for us, we're almost like a white label service for these physician groups. Like, my company is Hightower Clinical, but if I'm here working with the doctor, they don't know that. I'm a part of the practice as far as everyone's concerned.
Yes.
And I think that also gives some accountability to the group because what you're doing is representing them, not necessarily some third-party company that's down the block.
Right. I think Element Research Group did a great job with that. I mean, we were part of, I felt like the doctor's staff when I was at that particular doctor's office. So that was something that they did, and they did it really well.
Yeah, that's huge. It goes back to, a podcast I did previously. It's about that relationship. If you can build those relationships, they become ridiculously important to your success as a research group.
Yes, I think so as well. I agree. And I like that experience. I'm glad to have had that. So
yeah, no, that's good. I'm always encouraged to see people kind of make that jump from, large academic institution where, I know when I worked there, I was like, this is insane. How does anyone get anything done? I don't understand how this industry works until I really started to break out and see like, oh, there's a whole different way to do this that makes way more sense. We don't have to be beholden to the large siloed institutions. So that's always very encouraging for me to see.
But, though, just a one side note is I feel in my experience that, Element took a risk on me and it worked out. Again, it was perfect timing. That's a hard transition to make because I think sometimes there's a stigma between academic research coordinators and small private practice group research coordinators. And I think sometimes it's without understanding that, hey, we both have the same skill set. We're just in a different environment.
Well, yeah. And I mean, obviously, I feel academia lends itself to just a different view. So,
yeah,
in my experience in academia, it was more important to have a lot of letters after your name,
yes,
than to be a good research coordinator. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. Some of the best coordinators I've seen have high school educations.
Absolutely.
And some of the worst coordinators I've seen are foreign MDs or, have masters in public health. Now, obviously, that's not a blanket statement. It's just the point is that it's more valued in academia to have more education, even though that doesn't necessarily translate to being a good coordinator.
Agreed. That's a perfect way to say it.
Absolutely. So again, it looks like I'm very impressed to see how you've progressed throughout your career. What's a best practice that you've sort of picked up along the way, or something you'd share with the greater clinical research community?
For me, I think the best practice is just attention to detail, quality over quantity. If we just slow down and do it correctly the first time, we're going to have so much less hassle on the back end moving forward. And by that, I mean making sure your source stocks are right, taking that time with that patient, making sure your data entry isn't rushed. So you don't have to, answer all these queries, 3 days from now when you're slammed with patient visits. Just slowing down and having that attention to detail and organizing your day to be able to do that. That's my best practice.
Yeah, that's something that I need to hear and I need to do. I'm a bigger picture thinker generally, so I struggle with sometimes the details that go into some of these things. That's not to say that I can't coordinate a trial, and I do still coordinate trials even now, but that's something I have to constantly remind myself of, just because I'm not naturally detail oriented.
Right.
So I love that. Obviously, that's a huge skill you look for when you do hire or work with clinical research
I
coordinators.
think so. You just don't want your monitor to come and find all these things in your source docs that you then have to fix and notes to file, and it's just so much more work on the back end. That's just my opinion and my experience, though.
Yeah, no, there's no question. There's nothing worse than enrolling 10 patients and having your monitor come and having to
Oh, yeah.
make the same 10 changes or the same 10 mistakes that you've made over and over again.
Right. And then you just don't look like a confident site. You don't look like you're doing well. And it's like, well, no, I'm just trying to get all these patients in to meet quota. And you're like, well, slow down.
Right.
Like, I'd rather bring in 1 or 2 at a time than like 5 on one day.
Right. Yep. Nope. That's a fair point. So, what are some resources that you use in your job to make it easier? Is there anything specifically that you lean on, whether it's software or a process, a book, any kind of resource?
Actually, I'm a member of the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, so ACRP, and I really think that is a great resource. For continuing education, anytime I have a question or need clarification, they have a beautiful dashboard for helping understand different aspects of the trials. If you're confused or something doesn't make sense, I have always relied on that and will continue to do so. I mean, I'm still attending webinars now in quarantine, so that's my go-to.
Sure.
There are some other sites out there. I know Dan Serfer does have a book. I think that's a good little handbook to have, especially if somebody's new into clinical research. I wish I would have had a book like that when I started.
Yeah, for
yes,
sure.
But definitely.
Yeah. So yeah, the ACRP. I've spent a little bit of time in their community forums. It looks like there's a lot of good conversation there, which is a huge benefit for people, because again, where do you go to ask questions that are so specific? I think there's a lot of stuff on there that's great for people who are looking for help with specific issues. Obviously, there's all the webinars and other resources from the ACRP site. And yeah, I recently bought a copy of Dan's book, and I'm going to start having my new coordinators read it. Again, I think the quicker you can get somebody sort of the big picture, the easier it is to understand how all these things fit together. Because I mean, we live in a world that's got a million ridiculous acronyms, and just you learn very piecemeal. So it takes a long time for people to really get confident.
Right.
So whatever you can do to sort of give people that bigger picture, I think is a big value.
And I think another resource for me, or definitely for me, is our monitors for any trial. I think a lot of times in my experience, people are like, oh, the monitor's coming. And I'm like, no, the monitor's coming. I get to ask a lot of questions. And I think that relationship of, hey, we're still on a team. You're coming to monitor me. I'm the coordinator at your site. Let's work on this together. I am not too shy to reach out to my monitor if I have any questions, because that is an invaluable resource, in my opinion. That's my team.
Again, yeah, that goes back to just building those relationships. They can be your enemy or they can be your friend. It's really a matter of how you approach that. And
they want your site to be successful. So I've had great monitors. Right. I can only think of one that was a little touch and go. Definitely, it was an NIH trial that I worked on at an academic center. So it was a very different experience with that monitor. But I feel like I've been very blessed with monitors, and they represent a variety of the CROs that are out there. So
sure. Yeah. I mean, we've certainly had our share of bad monitors. There's nothing worse than having 8 monitors throughout the course of your study, because there's so much turnover from these CRO sides. So that can be challenging and just, annoying. It can be annoying to have to deal with the way that 8 different people want things done when they all don't jive with each other.
Right. Just recently, at the very end, before, we were furloughed, we had a monitor come in and caught things that a previous monitor that had been on the trial for 2 years never caught.
Sure.
So it was interesting, a different eyes. And it was like, oh, okay, great. And you did that. And it was like, oh, I can't believe 2 years later we're fixing this. But
right.
We're all human.
It's true. It happens. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Where can people find you online?
LinkedIn. It's where
LinkedIn. Okay,
pretty active.
I'm gonna put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes. I'll go ahead and include a LinkedIn or a LinkedIn. I'll include a link to the ACRP website. I'll go ahead and plug Dan's book for him,
It's a
just
good book.
cause.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll put all that information in the show notes. Be developing your skills as much as you can if you're stuck at home or furloughed or otherwise not able to get out there and see patients.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. I think this is a great concept, and I look forward to following you and learning more as you bring more people on for interviewing and watching you get successful with this. This is great.
Well, I appreciate it again. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'd love to have you back here before too long. So we'll talk. And thank you very much, Lorraine.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. For guest contact information, as well as any resources mentioned throughout this episode, please check out the show notes at www.notetofilepodcast.com. If you have any questions, comments, or interview requests, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm Brad at notetofilepodcast.com. And once again, thank you for listening.